In 1985, a respected pastor from a small Louisiana parish vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispered prayers and unanswered questions. The morning Father Gabriel Thibodeau disappeared. The bayou mist hung thick over St. Mary's Chapel, like a shroud, and the church bells never rang for morning service. His empty rectory stood as a monument to mystery, with coffee still warm on the kitchen table, and his sermon notes scattered across the oak desk, as if he had simply evaporated into the humid air. The parishioners searched the marshlands for days, their voices echoing across the cypress trees, calling his name until their throats were raw and their hope had withered like Spanish moss in the summer heat. But Gabriel Thibodeau had vanished as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. 20 years later, Hurricane Katrina would sweep through New Orleans like the wrath of God, and in that chaos, two young brothers named Marcus and David Thibodeau, Gabriel's great-nephews, would also disappear into the storm's hungry embrace. The floodwaters rose like biblical judgment, transforming familiar streets into rivers of destruction. And when they finally receded, the boys were gone, leaving only their grandmother's tears and a city drowning in its own grief. Their disappearance became another casualty of Katrina's fury, buried beneath the rubble of 1,000 other tragedies, their names lost in the endless lists of the missing and presumed dead. The family had endured one vanishing. Now they faced another, as if some curse had settled over the Thibodeau bloodline like a heavy fog that never lifted. In the aftermath, as New Orleans slowly rebuilt itself from the water's devastation, the boy's older sister Claire would carry both losses like stones in her chest, each breath a reminder of all she had lost. Claire Thibodeau had been 17 when Katrina hit, old enough to remember the way her brother's laughter had filled their grandmother's shotgun house, young enough to believe that missing people always came home. She had spent her childhood listening to stories about Great-Uncle Gabriel, the holy man who had vanished into legend, and she had always imagined he was watching over them from wherever spirits go when they leave this world. But when the storm took Marcus and David, something inside her broke that no amount of prayer could mend, and she began to question everything she had been taught about faith, mercy, and divine protection. The God she had known since childhood seemed to have abandoned her family twice, first taking the pastor and then claiming the children, leaving behind only silence and the bitter taste of betrayal. She stopped attending church, stopped believing in miracles, and built walls around her heart that no amount of love could breach. By 2018, Claire had become a forensic archaeologist, drawn to the science of uncovering truth from buried evidence, finding solace in facts rather than faith. She had left New Orleans after college, unable to bear the weight of memory that pressed down on every street corner, every familiar landmark that whispered of what she had lost. Her work took her to dig sites across the country where she could lose herself in the methodical process of excavation, brushing away centuries of dirt to reveal fragments of forgotten lives. There was something healing in the precision of her work, the way each artifact told a story that could be documented, verified, and understood, unlike the mysteries that had haunted her family for generations. She had built a new life in Arizona, far from the humidity and ghosts of Louisiana, where the desert sun could burn away the shadows of her past. But in October of 2018, a phone call would shatter the careful distance she had maintained between herself and her hometown. A construction crew working on flood mitigation in the 9th Ward had uncovered something impossible. A buried boat, preserved in the mud like a time capsule, and inside it were toys that would reopen wounds she thought had scarred over. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Detective Ray Boudreau, a man who had worked the Katrina disappearances, and his words carried the weight of revelation. "Miss Thibodeau, we found something that belongs to your family." The toys were unmistakable. A small red fire truck and a stuffed alligator that had been David's constant companion, both impossibly intact after 13 years in the Louisiana soil. As Claire gripped the phone with shaking hands, she realized that the dead don't always stay buried, and sometimes the past reaches up from the earth to demand its due. The flight back to New Orleans felt like a descent into purgatory, each mile bringing Claire closer to the ghosts she had spent years trying to escape. As the plane circled above the city, she could see the scars that Katrina had left on the landscape. Empty lots where houses once stood, new construction rising like monuments to resilience, and the serpentine curve of the Mississippi River that had watched over countless tragedies. The humid air hit her like a physical blow when she stepped off the plane, thick with the scent of magnolias and decay that she remembered from childhood. And she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with breathing Louisiana air. Detective Boudreau met her at the airport, his weathered face carrying the weight of too many unsolved cases, and she could see in his eyes the same haunted look that stared back at her from mirrors. The drive through the city was a tour of resurrection and ruin, past rebuilt neighborhoods and abandoned lots, each block a reminder of how completely the storm had rewritten the city's story. The evidence room at the police station smelled of disinfectant and old paper, but when Detective Boudreau opened the sealed box containing her brother's toys, the years collapsed like a house of cards. The fire truck's red paint had faded but was still recognizable. Its tiny ladder still extended as if David had been playing with it moments before, and the stuffed alligator, Chomper, Marcus had called him, sat staring at her with button eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Claire's hands trembled as she reached for the toys, feeling their weight like relics from a life she had tried to forget, and she could almost hear her brother's voices echoing in the sterile room. The preservation was uncanny. The mud had acted like a protective cocoon, keeping the toys exactly as they had been on that terrible day in 2005, as if time itself had stopped at the moment of their disappearance. But it was the presence of the toys in the buried boat that made no sense. How had they gotten there? And why had they been preserved when everything else from that day had been lost? Detective Boudreau led her to the excavation site, where the boat sat partially unearthed like a wooden coffin rising from the dead. The vessel was old, probably from the 1980s, and it had been buried deliberately, not randomly deposited by floodwaters as she had initially assumed. The positioning was too precise, too intentional, and Claire's trained eye immediately recognized the signs of human intervention, the way the earth had been disturbed and then carefully replaced, the organic matter that had been layered to speed decomposition. This wasn't a storm burial. This was a grave, and someone had taken great care to hide it from the world. Her brother's toys had been placed inside with almost ceremonial precision, positioned as if they were offerings to some dark god, and the realization sent ice water through her veins. The boat wasn't just a hiding place. It was a shrine, a monument to something terrible that had happened here long before Katrina ever touched the Gulf Coast. As she knelt beside the excavation, Claire's fingers traced the boat's weathered wood, and she felt a strange tingling sensation, as if the vessel itself was trying to communicate with her. The wood grain told a story of decades underwater, of being submerged and then buried, and her archaeological training kicked in as she began to read the signs that others had missed. There were scratches on the interior hull, deliberate markings that looked almost like letters, and when she angled her phone's flashlight just right, she could make out what appeared to be initials, GT, carved into the wood with a trembling hand. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. Those were her great-uncle's initials, Gabriel Thibodeau, the pastor who had vanished in 1985. The boat wasn't just connected to her brother's disappearance. It was connected to the family's original tragedy, the loss that had cast a shadow over their bloodline for generations. The toys, the boat, the careful burial, it all pointed to a connection between the two disappearances that was more than coincidence. Detective Boudreau watched her face as the realization dawned, and she saw in his expression that he had been waiting for her to make this connection. "Miss Thibodeau," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant revelation, "there's something else you need to know about this boat." He led her to a section of the hull that had been carefully cleaned by the forensics team, where more scratches were visible, and these weren't just initials. They were words, carved, with desperate urgency into the wood. "Help us," the message read, followed by a date that made Claire's blood run cold. August 29th, 2005, the day Hurricane Katrina made landfall. The message wasn't old, it was recent, carved by someone who had been trapped in this boat during the storm, and that someone had known about her brother's toys. The implications crashed over her like a wave of understanding so terrible that she stumbled backward, her mind reeling with the possibility that Marcus and David hadn't drowned in the flood. They had been buried alive, trapped in this wooden coffin while the city drowned around them. The discovery of the message in the boat sent shockwaves through the investigation, transforming what had been a tragic accident into something far more sinister. Detective Boudreau immediately called in the FBI, and within hours, the excavation site was swarming with federal agents and forensics teams. their white hazmat suits moving across the muddy ground like specters in a nightmare. Claire found herself at the center of a media storm, with reporters calling her hotel room at all hours, demanding interviews about the Katrina coffin and the buried brothers, but she refused to speak to any of them, too shaken by the implications to face the cameras. The FBI team leader, Agent Sarah Chen, was a woman about Claire's age with kind eyes and a gentle manner that somehow made the horror of the situation more bearable. She explained that the boat would be completely excavated and examined for additional evidence, including DNA testing to determine if the boys had actually been inside the vessel, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence. The waiting was unbearable, each hour stretching into an eternity of possibility and dread, and Claire found herself unable to sleep, pacing her hotel room like a caged animal. She had spent 13 years believing her brothers had died in the storm, accepting their deaths as part of Katrina's random cruelty. But now she faced the possibility that they had been murdered, deliberately trapped, and left to die while the city flooded around them. The thought was so monstrous that her mind rejected it, but her scientific training forced her to confront the evidence with cold logic. Someone had buried that boat before the storm hit, someone who had known about the approaching hurricane, and had used it as cover for their crime. The toys hadn't been placed there by accident. They had been positioned as a message, a calling card left by someone who wanted the truth to eventually surface. Agent Chen called her to the FBI field office 3 days after the excavation began, and Claire knew from the woman's expression that the news would be devastating. The DNA testing had confirmed what she had feared. Both Marcus and David had been in the boat, and the evidence suggested they had been alive when it was buried. The scratches on the wood weren't just desperate messages. They were the final acts of 2 children trying to claw their way to freedom, and the forensics team had found tiny fragments of flesh under their fingernails from where they had tried to dig through the wood. Claire collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with a grief so profound that it felt like drowning, and Agent Chen's voice seemed to come from very far away as she explained the full scope of what they had discovered. The boat had been fitted with a crude air filtration system, suggesting that whoever had buried the boys had intended them to survive for a while, to suffer before they died. The investigation took on a new urgency, with FBI agents interviewing everyone who had been in the area during the days leading up to Katrina, and Claire found herself drawn into the process as both a victim's family member and a forensic expert. She spent hours going through old case files, looking for connections between her brother's disappearance and other unsolved crimes. And it was during this research that she discovered something that made her stomach turn. There had been other disappearances in the area over the years, children who had vanished without a trace, and many of them had been connected to St. Mary's Chapel, the church where her great-uncle Gabriel had served as pastor. The pattern was subtle, easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. But once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. Young boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 12, who had attended Sunday school or church events, all vanishing during times of community crisis or natural disaster. The connections were thin, circumstantial, but they painted a picture of predatory behavior that had been hidden within the church community for decades. Claire's hands shook as she compiled the evidence, creating a timeline that stretched back to the 1980s, and she began to see a pattern that made her soul sick. Her great-uncle Gabriel hadn't disappeared in 1985. He had been silenced, possibly murdered, by someone who wanted to keep him from exposing the truth about what was happening to the children in his care. The boat wasn't just a murder weapon. It was a tradition, a method that had been used before, and Marcus and David had been the latest victims in a string of crimes that had been covered up by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. The realization that her brothers had been betrayed by their own church, by people they had trusted and loved, was almost too much to bear. But as she sat in the FBI office, surrounded by evidence of unspeakable evil, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A burning need for justice that was stronger than her grief. A righteous anger that demanded action. The FBI investigation led Claire back to the ruins of St. Mary's Chapel, which had been abandoned since Hurricane Katrina, and now stood like a broken monument to faith betrayed. The building's Gothic windows were boarded up, its bell tower leaning precariously against the storm-darkened sky, and Spanish moss hung from the oak trees like funeral shrouds. Agent Chen had arranged for Claire to walk through the chapel with Father Michael Dupuis, the elderly priest who had served the parish before Gabriel's disappearance, and who had returned to New Orleans to help with the investigation. Father Dupuis was a fragile man in his 70s, with trembling hands and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of terrible knowledge. And Claire could see that he was struggling with some internal conflict as they approached the chapel's heavy, wooden doors. The building smelled of mold and decay, but underneath the odor of abandonment, Claire detected something else: the faint scent of incense and candle wax that still lingered in the sacred space. Inside the chapel, Father Dupuis moved like a ghost, returning to haunt his past, his fingers trailing along the damaged pews and stopping at the altar where Gabriel had once celebrated Mass. The stained glass windows were cracked, but still beautiful, casting fractured rainbows across the floor, and Claire could almost hear the echoes of her brother's voices singing in the children's choir. Father Dupuis began to speak in a whisper, his voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the broken windows, and his words carried the weight of confession. I knew something was wrong, but I was too afraid to speak. He told her about the late-night meetings that Gabriel had mentioned, the way certain parishioners would gather in the church basement after hours, and how Gabriel had become increasingly agitated in the weeks before his disappearance. The old priest's hands shook as he described finding Gabriel's study ransacked, his files scattered, and his personal effects missing, and the way the church hierarchy had quickly moved to suppress any investigation into the pastor's fate. As they descended into the church basement, Claire felt the temperature drop noticeably, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and old secrets. The basement had been used for Sunday school classes and community meetings, but now it was a maze of water-damaged furniture and moldering religious artifacts. Father Dupuis led her to a corner of the basement where a small door was hidden behind a bookshelf, and when they moved the heavy wooden furniture aside, they found a room that Claire was certain had never appeared on any church blueprints. The hidden chamber was small and windowless, with stone walls that seemed to absorb sound, and it was clear that this space had been used for purposes that had nothing to do with worship. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, showing children from the parish over the years, and Claire's heart stopped when she saw her brother's faces among them. The photographs weren't innocent Sunday school pictures, they were surveillance photos, taken without the children's knowledge, and they had been organized with the meticulous care of a predator documenting his prey. Father Dupuis collapsed into a chair when he saw the photographs, his face ashen with horror and recognition, and Claire realized that he had suspected, but never confirmed what was happening in his church. Through tears, he told her about Deacon Raymond Tasso, a wealthy businessman who had been one of the church's biggest donors and who had taken a special interest in the youth programs. Tasso had been the one organizing the late-night meetings, the one who had access to the church at all hours, and the one who had been present during many of the disappearances over the years. Gabriel had been investigating Tasso's activities, gathering evidence of abuse and preparing to expose him. But before he could act, he had vanished. Father Dupuis had been too terrified to continue Gabriel's work, too afraid of what Tasso might do to him if he spoke out, and he had spent 33 years living with the guilt of his silence. The weight of this revelation crashed over Claire, like a tsunami of rage and grief, and she understood that her brothers had been killed not by a random predator, but by a pillar of the church community who had used his position to prey on children for decades. The hidden room contained more than just photographs. There were journals, detailed records of abuse, and plans for what Tasso had called special trips for selected children. Claire found her brothers' names in the most recent journal, along with detailed notes about their schedules, their interests, and their vulnerabilities. The final entry was dated August 28, 2005, the day before Hurricane Katrina made landfall, and it described Tasso's plan to use the approaching storm as cover for his crimes. He had convinced Marcus and David that they were being taken to a safe house to wait out the hurricane, but instead, he had buried them alive in the boat, intending to let the storm cover up the evidence of his crime. The journal revealed that Tasso had been planning to leave New Orleans permanently after Katrina, using the chaos of the storm to disappear and start fresh somewhere else. But first, he wanted to eliminate the witnesses who could expose his decades of abuse. Claire's hands trembled as she read the meticulous plans for murder, and she realized that her brothers had been killed not just by a predator, but by a methodical killer who had been perfecting his techniques for 30 years. The evidence against Deacon Raymond Tasso was overwhelming, but when the FBI went to arrest him, they discovered that he had died 3 years earlier, taking his secrets to a grave in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. The news hit Claire like a physical blow, robbing her of the confrontation and justice she had been craving. But Agent Chen assured her that the investigation was far from over. Tasso had been part of a network, and the hidden room in the church basement contained evidence of other perpetrators who were still alive, including several prominent members of the New Orleans community who had participated in the abuse ring. The FBI began making arrests within days, and Claire watched from her hotel room as news vans surrounded the homes of respected businessmen, city officials, and even other clergy members who had been part of Tasso's network. The scandal rocked New Orleans to its core, with headlines screaming about the cathedral conspiracy and the buried truth of St. Mary's Chapel. But for Claire, the media circus felt hollow and inadequate compared to the magnitude of what had been lost. Father Dupuis became the investigation's key witness, finally finding the courage to speak the truth he had carried for over 3 decades. His testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, describing how Tasso had used his wealth and influence to protect the abuse ring, bribing officials and threatening witnesses to maintain his network of silence. The elderly priest's voice shook as he described the night Gabriel had confided in him about the evidence he had gathered, and how Father Dupuis had urged him to go to the authorities immediately. But Gabriel had wanted to be absolutely certain of his facts before making accusations that would destroy lives, and that hesitation had cost him his life. Tasso had learned about Gabriel's investigation and had arranged for the pastor to be murdered, making it look like a disappearance rather than a homicide. The boat that had become Marcus and David's grave had also been Gabriel's tomb, and forensic examination revealed traces of the pastor's DNA in the wood, suggesting that he had been the first victim of Tasso's burial method. As the investigation expanded, Claire found herself drawn back to the excavation site, where additional boats were being uncovered from the muddy ground. Each vessel told a story of horror, containing the remains of children who had vanished over the years, and Claire realized that she was standing in the middle of a mass grave that had been hidden for decades. The weight of so much suffering was almost unbearable, but she forced herself to bear witness to each discovery, feeling that she owed it to the victims to acknowledge their pain. The forensics team worked with reverent care, treating each small skeleton as if it were their own child. And Claire was moved by the dedication of the investigators, who were finally giving these forgotten children the justice they deserved. Among the boats, they found personal items that had been buried with the victims: toys, pieces of clothing, religious medals, and each artifact was a reminder of the innocence that had been stolen from these young lives. The trial of the surviving conspirators began 6 months later, and Claire testified about her brother's disappearance and the impact it had on her family. She spoke directly to the defendants, looking into their eyes as she described the hole that Marcus and David's death had torn in her life, and she saw several of them break down in tears as the full weight of their crimes became clear. The prosecutor painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been enabled by the church's culture of silence and deference to authority. And Claire realized that her brothers had been failed not just by their killers, but by an entire community that had chosen to look the other way. The defense attorneys tried to argue that their clients had been manipulated by Tasso, that they were victims themselves, but the evidence was too strong and the testimony too damning for such excuses to hold water. One by one, the defendants were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and Claire felt a sense of closure that she had never expected to experience. But the most powerful moment came when the judge allowed Claire to address the court during the sentencing phase, and she found herself speaking not just about her brothers, but about her great-uncle Gabriel and all the other victims who had been silenced over the years. She talked about the faith that had been stolen from her family, the way the church had been corrupted by evil men who had used God's name to justify their crimes, and how the truth had finally emerged from the buried boats like a resurrection. Her voice was strong and clear as she spoke of forgiveness, not for the perpetrators, but for herself, for the guilt she had carried about surviving when her brothers had not. The courtroom was silent as she finished her statement, and she felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the knots of anger and grief that had bound her for so many years. The dead had been given their due, the truth had been told, and justice had been served. In the months following the trial, Claire found herself returning to New Orleans regularly, drawn by a need to help rebuild what had been broken. She worked with the FBI to establish a foundation for the victims' families, using her expertise in forensic archaeology to help identify additional remains and bring closure to other families who had lost children to the conspiracy. The work was heartbreaking but necessary, and she found healing in the process of giving names and dignity to the forgotten victims. St. Mary's Chapel was demolished, its stones scattered and its dark history finally laid to rest. But in its place, the community built a memorial garden where families could come to remember their lost children. Claire helped design the memorial, creating a space that honored the victims while acknowledging the complexity of faith and forgiveness in the face of unspeakable evil. The foundation also worked to reform the church's policies regarding child protection, implementing new safeguards and training programs to prevent future abuse. Claire found herself working closely with reform-minded clergy members who were committed to rebuilding trust in the institution, and she was surprised to discover that her faith, while changed, had not been destroyed by the revelations of the investigation. She began attending services at a small community church in the French Quarter, where the pastor was a young woman who spoke honestly about the church's failures and the need for accountability. The sermons were different from those she remembered from childhood, less about blind obedience and more about the responsibility of faith communities to protect the vulnerable. And Claire found herself slowly opening her heart to the possibility of spiritual healing. Prayer felt different now, less like begging for divine intervention, and more like a conversation with a God who understood both justice and mercy. The memorial garden became a place of pilgrimage for families affected by the conspiracy, and Claire often found herself there at sunrise, tending to the flowers and reading the names carved into the memorial stones. Marcus and David's names were there, along with Gabriel's and all the other victims, and she would speak to them as if they were still present, telling them about her work and the changes that were happening in their memory. The garden was designed to be a living memorial, with fruit trees and vegetable plots that fed the community. And Claire found deep satisfaction in the knowledge that something good was growing from the soil that had hidden so much evil. Children from the neighborhood would come to help with the gardening, their laughter filling the space with joy and hope. And Claire realized that this was what resurrection looked like. Not a return to what was, but a transformation of what could be. Father Dupuis, now in his late 70s, had become a close friend and collaborator in the Foundation's work, and his courage in speaking the truth had inspired other survivors to come forward with their own stories. He had established a support group for clergy members who had struggled with the burden of institutional silence, and his leadership had helped begin a larger conversation about accountability and reform within the church. Together, he and Claire worked to create educational programs that would help communities recognize the signs of abuse and respond appropriately, and they traveled across the country sharing their story with other dioceses and denominations. The work was difficult and sometimes painful, but it was also deeply meaningful, and Claire found purpose in ensuring that her brother's deaths would prevent future tragedies. As she stood in the memorial garden on the 13th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, Claire felt a peace she had never expected to experience. The investigation had given her back her brother's story, transforming their deaths from a random tragedy into a catalyst for justice and change. She had found her faith again, not in the institution that had failed her family, but in the possibility of redemption and the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. The sun was setting over New Orleans, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Claire could almost hear her brother's voices in the evening breeze, no longer crying for help but singing in harmony with the choir of angels that she now believed were real. The toys that had been found in the buried boat were now displayed in the Memorial Garden's small museum, but they were no longer symbols of death and despair. They had become reminders of the innocent joy that evil could never fully destroy. Claire whispered a prayer of gratitude for the long journey that had brought her to this moment, and she knew that Marcus and David were finally at peace, their names restored and their truth finally told.